I'm not an expert in U.S. law. I damn sure ain't an expert in JP law, but I've done a good bit of reading about this stuff, so I feel a little bit more qualified than maybe some other people who talk about it. Even that has an asterisk by it, because I'm not qualified at all, right? I told you guys, I'm not the construction worker that goes around solving problems. I'm just the one that points out and says, hey, that looks messed up. Let's talk about it. What most of you guys are probably wondering, your biggest burning question, is why didn't Momochi get his money? That's the core question. That's what a lot of you guys want to know. The short answer is he was unable to get his money because he refuses to enroll in the JeSU program, pro license program. That's the start. Now, from that answer, there's going to be more questions, right? You're probably wondering, what is JeSU? JeSU is the Japan Esports Union, and it's a collection of officials across gaming and sports industries in Japan with a large measure of influence and allegiances pledged to them by many gaming developers and publishers in Japan. That's the short answer. The long answer is, about 4 or 5 years ago, there were maybe 3 or 4 different kind of esports startup groups with the goal of running events, being able to, monetize, run bigger events. I believe JeSU was one of them. JESL, there was JESPA, JESF. There was like 4 or 5 of them. Eventually, they consolidated power and efforts, and they came together to try to, work together to build whatever it is that they're looking for, right? Essentially, what this group does is they serve as a bridge between gaming communities, pubs and developers, and the government in Japan. They are not inherently government. They serve as a bridge between those 3 parties. This is not a completely random group of old dudes, right? A lot of these guys are really well connected, and like I said, across games and sports. The boss is, one of the top ranking officials at Sega. Probably doesn't mean that much to you if you're in the West, but Sega's a really big deal out here, man. They control a lot of stuff. The real estate. They own lots of buildings. They own lots of amusement centers. All that stuff. It goes pretty deep, actually. Kadokawa Publishing is, just for example, that's another high-ranking official that's attached to this group. They publish both printed and digital media. Pretty big publisher in Japan. HSBC, Sanko, Capcom, Konami Entertainment, Gung Ho. There's lots of gaming companies that are represented in this union, but then also sports as well. You have Japan Urban Sports, the Golf Association in Japan, and then soccer as well. And then these are all the companies that kind of co-sign with JeSU, right? I mean, it's a huge list of just not only game developers, but mobile developers as well, right? Kadokawa, SNK, Arc System Works, Capcom, Square, I believe Square Enix is on here too, Sony Entertainment. I mean, everybody's on here. You scroll down, and this is also a list of companies that are connected to them as well. You have NTT Docomo right at the top of my head. That's essentially the Verizon Wireless of Japan. Huge companies now are kind of connected to this. Due to this collection of VIPs and connections that these guys are going to have, as a unit, they probably have more power and influence than any collection of unions or like player union plus lawyers could have. If you're gonna have a group of people that can kind of face the government and get stuff done, probably a solid unit to be able to do that in Japan. That's what JeSU is in a nutshell. The next question that you probably have to ask yourself is, what the hell is the license system? Why does that matter? The licensing system that is produced by JeSU is designed to establish a link between developers, JeSU, players, and community, where prize money can legally be reinterpreted as compensation for labor. Remember that term. That's important when you talk about JP law. So the big thing is, this group established the system in order to be able to create a regulation system where players, devs, and the government can all work together to be able to run events and be able to use prize money in similar ways that we're used to. By doing this, they're able to break or exploit a certain loophole in the government, in the law, that would normally restrict prize pooling for events. They're able to bypass that using the license system, because that license system, it essentially makes an agreement that says, hey, this is a worker, and that this prize money is essentially compensation for his work, his or her work. So what I want to show you now is this. This is showing you something that you have to understand at a base level too. In Japan, the way that prize pooling works with tournaments, or the way they're regulated by law, it currently works like this. What the left side says is, if the game is free to play, and they define free to play as like, if you don't spend money and it gives you an edge in the game. If it's a free to play game, there is no limit on prize money that you can put into it. On the right side, if the game is a game that is sold and distributed, there is a restriction on the prize money. So Yuri made this he does it in a really well presented way. I'm gonna put a link to it in the description of this video. He put a lot of effort into making this as easily digestible and presentable as possible. And without him, I wouldn't have been able to have a better grasp on this stuff. He actually released an addendum to it yesterday, where he clarified a few points. And one of them comes up now. We already established that there's the difference between free-to-play games and games for sale in Japan, right? The second is here. The the guidelines of the games for sale, there's two types of prize poolings, and this is what you have to understand. On the left side, what that says is that if it's a stakeholder organized event, normally the prize pool is restricted at $1,000. There is an asterisk to this. Events in Japan can take entry fees. That entry fee is not allowed to be added to the pot. That entry fee is allowed to be used to pay out staff and to be able to get resources, pay for venue, etc., etc. But it's not allowed to be contributed to a pot. On the B side, however, if the prize sponsor, or pot bonus sponsor, whatever you want to call it, if they are a third party, there is no limit. On the left-hand side, however, there is a limit. It's $1,000 if you're a first-party prize pool sponsor. So now, given what I just told you, think about EVO Japan, and then think about Capcom Pro Tour Super Premiere at TGS. Which do you think goes where? Think about that. So here's the thing. If you look on the left side, right, there's a restriction on how much prize money you can put up for your own tournament, limited to $1,000. However, if the prize money is not quote-unquote prize money, if the prize money can be considered compensation for labor, then you don't have to abide by this rule. And that's what's important. So go back just a few seconds to what I said about the licensing system, how that's supposed to create a link that essentially says, hey, this prize money is being reinterpreted as compensation for work. That's what the goal of the license system is to do. What the bottom part says is, if you can have the tournament interpreted as work, the player is an employee, and the prize pool is interpreted as compensation for work, then you can bypass this limit. Prize pool boosts, etc., etc. Now, what you have to understand is this. JeSU's license is not necessary for what you are doing and for what prize money you get to be interpreted that way. That was something that got released last week in the letter that they got back from the Consumer Affairs Agency that said it's not necessary to establish a compensation for labor relationship if the conditions for work, they use those exact terms, if the tournament can be considered work, if the game and the environment that it's in can be considered work, then you don't necessarily need to have the compensation for labor or anything like that, right? Given that they made that announcement last week, and I'll put this out there. These are just two lingering questions that I have, but also one of them is a big one, right? So, if you don't need the license necessarily in order to get your prize money in this case, why would JeSU say that? Isn't it beneficial for them if everyone views their thing as more official or more legitimate? Second, what would it take? Or is it even possible for the government in Japan to recognize game tournaments as work? Thus, with those questions in the back of your mind, you can think of JeSU as a uniform standard for trying to establish tournament participation as work on behalf of the players, the community, government, devs, stakeholders, and etc. This body exists to try to push some of this and to try to change some of these reinterpretations legally. And they're a very big, influential body that exists as a bridge in between all of those parties that I just mentioned, probably has a very strong voice to the government in terms of being able to do this. Fundamentally what JeSU is and what the pro-license system represents. The next part that I'm going to get to is here. This article is something that you should go back to and take a look at if you want to get an understanding on what Momochi's core values are. Because the next fundamental question you're going to have is, well, why does Momochi refuse their system? If he takes the license, he's able to get all of his money. No big deal, right? $49,000, that's a lot to turn down. This is an excerpt from that translated article. Why does a newly formed specialized group have the right to define what we are? The community, the players, they worked for years, decades even, to establish what some of this, what a professional is. People who ignore the community and trying to, again, just make an announcement of just this arbitrary system without even taking the community's thoughts and their feedback into account. What he said was, it's difficult for him to feel any sort of affection or sincerity on their part. So you can imagine, especially at the time that they came out, this was a big deal because no one even knew what that was. They just announced, arbitrary announcement of this pro-license system. He then mentions, who wants this license system? Who is it really for? Will the players be happy with this? Or is this a plan to make a system in order for one side to gain something? If this is the kind of system that prioritizes creators or devs, publishers, desires over the games themselves, if it's something that deceives players with songs about a bright future while ignoring the voices of community and players, and to prevent those people from acting as a government tool and taking advantage of the community, he's here and prepared to fight. You get a sense for what he's saying. And to be fair, Momochi's concerns and a lot of the stuff that he brings up here, it's not unreasonable. Think about some of these like these concepts on macro scale. Would you be? Is it okay for people that are quote unquote bigger than the scene to come in and dictate some points, even if players and maybe some people are able to get benefits from it? Or is that something you're okay with? Those are the kind of questions that you have to ask yourself here. So that was a couple years ago, right? That was right when the licensing system was starting to get off the ground. Now, what happened to him in 2018 is what's interesting. If you recall, Momochi went to Capcom Cup in 2018 and got top 8, which meant he was eligible for some of the prize pool in there. Apparently, he was asked to enroll in the JP Pro licensing system in order to get his winnings. To which he replied, that's not in the rules. Fast forward, he protests a little bit about that. He doesn't enroll, and as a result, he was then limited again about how much money he could receive from that event because he did not enroll in the licensing system. Fast forward to Evo Japan. He wins the tournament. The entire finals, we're talking about it. Hey man, what's he gonna do? Is he gonna be able to get his money? Well, it turns out he won. There are some lingering questions there. However, at that time, he was mysteriously able to get all of the money from Evo Japan. Why is that? Fast forward again to April this year. This is from the Capcom Cup rule set. Remember in 2018 when he won, he got 7th place, but they kind of sprung the licensing system registration stuff on him at Capcom Cup. Well, now they heeded his warning and they actually put in the rule set this time. So on a macro level, you have Capcom strongly trying to enforce and trying to rein in players to enroll in this system. The lingering questions that I have here are also echoed in Momochi's original statement, where he has a fear. He said, I wonder if in the future they will use the licensing system as a way to imaginarily divide players, or to dictate what events players can go to, compete at, and win prize money from overseas. That was 2 years ago he said that. Fast forward, you slowly now have a series of events that kind of show an uncomfortable kind of truth there, right? Though this isn't inherently JeSU. This is on Capcom's side. So you have to wonder now, hold on, there's a JP system here that somehow is affecting players overseas? That's kind of weird. But then you think about it and it makes sense. If you want all of your players domestically to have to be enrolled in this system, well, it makes sense to try to force everyone else everywhere else to be a part of it, right? That just makes sense. I'm not saying this stuff to make you be like, fuck JeSU or anything like that. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is think about some of this stuff for yourself. Don't take it and just start riding on one side. This is actually a very, very delicate, very intricate situation with a lot of moving parts. It's very difficult to put all this together in your head and package it. It's tough. And this is something that Momochi said as well. He doesn't want other people campaigning for him or going ham like that. He said for most people, this is not even going to be an issue. Just take the license, just take the money. But something that he also expressed in his original statements and statements since then is that he feels like he has a duty as a professional and a duty because he has a voice to kind of voice these feelings that he has and these misgivings. And that's not unreasonable. So this is the tournament bracket for Evo Japan this past year. In the case of Evo Japan, you have to remember, Momochi wins. He does not have a pro license, given the reasons that I already showed you. But remember, the TGS bracket, that prize money was from a third party. Not only was the prize money from a third party, but Evo Japan, you had some very influential individuals, both, in front of the curtain and behind it. If something were to have come up, they had people there fighting for it. Capcom was not the primary sponsor of Evo Japan. Evo Japan had its own prize sponsors. Therefore, Momochi, despite not having the license, was okay to get the money in that instance. He got paid. Now remember what I was saying earlier about the differences between those two sides of the prize sponsoring. You remember part A and B here? I'll bring it up again. So remember this earlier. Evo Japan falls in the right side category, where they can have as much prize sponsorship as they want because it's third party. On the left side, however, Tokyo Game Show was a Capcom primary sponsored event. Thus, if you are not exposing the loophole by having this qualified as compensation for labor, then the limit for winning a TGS tournament is going to be up to $1,000 USD. Where in the case of Momochi, they gave him a monitor value at $300 and then gave him the rest in $600 cash, something like that. That's the primary difference between TGS and Evo Japan. Capcom is the primary sponsor of the TGS Super Premier. Thus, it's subject to a different kind of restrictions. So naturally, your next question is, what happened to the rest of that money? The next logical question. Well, the truth is that this has kind of happened with JeSU before, actually. In the case of the third-party sponsorship pool, Most of the third-party sponsors just retained that money. They just didn't, it never moved. But in the case of CPT TGS Super Premiere, since Capcom was the primary sponsor, you would imagine, I would guess, I don't know, but speculation, I would have to imagine Capcom keeps that money, right? That's a lingering question. I don't know. No one knows the answer to that. So we already went over what happens if you are the primary prize sponsor for a tournament, right? They said last week you do not need a license to get money in some cases, right? Which led to a big outcry on Twitter. Well, if you don't need the license, then what the hell, man? But there's nuances to that. One reason why the JeSU system is probably preferred by a lot of these developers and publishers is because out of the fear that if companies start prize sponsoring their own events like that, start jacking up prize pools, and then saying, hey, these players are just working, with no kind of system to regulate that, there's strong potential for the government to step in and shut a whole lot of shit down. If one company gets out of line with that shit, it's going to be pretty nasty. That's the core fear. That's probably why you have a lot of these companies subscribing to the JeSU system. They probably view this as their best chance for trying to be able to grow this and be able to develop the system into something legally sound. Given what I just told you, take a look at this. You can then think of 3 tournament structures that you're likely to see in Japan. This one is the first party prize sponsor tournament format, where, let's say in the case of like Capcom, right? If they have their prize pool for their game, all 8 players need pro licenses to be able to get prize pools over a certain amount of money. If it is a third-party tournament, if the prize sponsor comes from a third party, you do not necessarily need your pro license to be able to get the reward from, let's say if you win. The last kind that has been proposed by JeSU is this format. Under this proposed system, which you might see in the more of in the future, invitations essentially, where participants are screened, and if they meet certain requirements, then they can be considered as professionals or whatever, regardless of if they have a license or not, and they will be eligible to receive prize pool money. That's where the big question came in last week, where you saw a lot of people getting online like, you don't even need the license, blah blah blah. It's like, well, you don't, but it's the preferred method right now because it's the uniform standard. It's the status quo that all the devs are trying to push right now, because they view this as their best shot for being able to push this in legally. So now think about this. For an open tournament, the first 2 formats that I showed you just now are likely to be what you'd consider. And in which case, if you don't have a license, for most people this is easy. Let's say if you make it the top 8 of the first party prize sponsored tournament format, they simply give you a license, they give you money, you go home. It's fine. This format, however, is probably what will be preferred in a lot of situations from now on, because it works like this. It's simply an invitational. Red Bull Kumite follows this kind of format. You interview and you're able to quote-unquote screen players beforehand and determine that they meet the requirements for being considered professionals or whatever, they can play in the tournament. Fine. This is now work. And then everybody is eligible for prize money, no problems. However, for open tournaments, this is not likely to be, this can't be used. You can't screen or have an interview with, 1,000 entrants at an open bracket tournament. This is likely going to be favored because of it's more of an invitational style, and it's easier to control and regulate. Whereas the first 2, for open bracket tournaments, that's probably going to be your 2 formats that you're going to be looking at. So the question's always going to be, well, who's the prize pool sponsor? Is it a first party prize pool sponsor, or is it a third party prize pool sponsor? If it's third party, then it doesn't really matter. If it's first party, you need a license. You have to enroll. And again, I encourage you guys, I'm going to put links to all the resources that I've been reading over the past few days, and I encourage you guys to read a lot of this stuff on your own. It's like I said, it's been pretty interesting for me. I've been intrigued, so to speak. Maybe a question that a lot of you guys have is, now that you understand how Momochi feels and why he says what he says, and his feelings on it, you might be wondering like how other people feel about this, right? Well, the truth is, most other players seem to be, they're willing to kind of agree or go along with the system for now, with the promise that it will improve. Daigo did a sit down on his stream where he talked a lot about this, about what happened with Momochi and about what happened at TGS, and I'll summarize some of his thoughts here, the ones that I thought were most interesting anyway. Something that he mentioned that I thought was really cool was he was like, he has a very strong sense of respect for Momochi because he feels that the community as players needs someone like him. In particular, he said like Momochi's stubbornness is reminiscent of what you would expect from old-fashioned players, and that it would be bad for the community if people like him were gone. The way he was talking about Momochi had a very deep sense of respect, He thought that it would be bad if the system were to break down without doing anything inherently wrong. And he says at the moment he can't really say anything bad about the parties in play with the current system, be that Capcom or JeSU side. He thinks Momochi's struggle is good, but he feels bad for the people that are not necessarily related to it, that kind of have to face the ire of the community as a result. Overall, his sentiment was that a lot of this stuff is stuff that the JP community, they have to go through in order to create a brighter future for the young players. As much as he's down for the causes that, Momochi kind of stands for, and he does stand for some very fair and reasonable, he has valid concerns. That's very valid. That's very reasonable. Daigo's position as well, though, even though more moderate for sure, he certainly has a reasonable perspective on it. You probably do have to go through something like this in order to create change, in order to better the community, create a more favorable situation for the young players in the future. This is just something that they probably have to go through, right? This stuff, there's a lot of nuances at play. This is a lot of the JP law stuff. It's not very easy to digest and not very easy to understand. I hope I did a good job of being able to give you some insight or some understanding on the way some of this stuff works. What I want to talk about is the fact that, like, knowing all of this and seeing just how intricate this kind of is, this should be able to give you good perspective on one of the reasons why the tournament and event scene in Japan is kind of, I don't want to say underdeveloped, because there are lots of great events here, but in terms of monetizing it and in terms of being able to grow bigger and bigger to the kind of stage level that you would expect from a country like this place, right? In terms of fighting games, it should give you good perspective on just how difficult and what they've been fighting against for the past 20-something years, right? Now you should be able to see a little bit. The other thing is this. When you talk about Japan, when you talk about Japanese companies, when you talk about Japanese organizations, when you take a train to Shinjuku and you get off at the station, right? If you're a first-time foreigner in a place like that, it's a rush, because you're just like, you're looking around, there's all this chicken scratch everywhere, you don't know what the fuck's going on. For me personally, there's a sensation in Japan that I always find myself competing with, and it's two things that JP companies and organizations traditionally really struggle with. And you don't even have to think that far. Just think about our game devs. Think about our devs. What are two places that they consistently really struggle? In their defense, it's not just them. This is Japan. 2 words: transparency, communication. A little bit of transparency and a little bit of communication would have gone such a long way in this case in particular. Just imagine if you put that group together at the beginning, like 2 or 3 years ago, and you have somebody to interface with the community and say, hey man, what we're trying to build is this. What we're trying to do is this. But you have to understand, that is not Japan. Japan is not about that. Communication and transparency can go so far, but that's just something that they traditionally really, struggled with, right? And JeSU has been no different up until this point. And it's to the point now where, just being able to talk with people on the ground here and get, a sense for how they feel about some of this stuff, it's very difficult to give trust at this point. And one reason why is because they play no role in narrative here. There's no interface. There's nothing like that. So all the people have to go off of is, other players and their rudimentary understanding of how stuff works. That's definitely a lesson that we can take, right? Look at how good of a job, you can shit on NRS for, what's her name? Ronda Rousey's voice acting and how shitty their animations have looked for the past X years. But you damn sure can't shit on them for being communicative and transparent, because they've definitely been that. Can't say the same for a lot of your JP devs. Take those 2 words and think about them. Transparency, communication. Think about how far that goes. Given everything I've talked about so far, my whole goal was just to be able to present some of the points to you that I've read over the past 3 to 4 days and give you guys a better perspective or a better understanding of what's going on, actually. Because I've noticed a lot of misinformation, and it's no one's fault. It's just, this is, like I said, even in Japan, nobody knows what the hell most of this stuff is. But I just wanted to break some of this down for you guys and give you guys a better grasp on the situation. The last thing that I wanted to bring up is this. When you think about esports or whatever, what a lot of it is based on, just like advertising, using communities to be able to sell product and market them. I don't want to phrase it as with overly negative nuance, but you get what I'm saying, right? On some level, the community is being sold. Now, we can make peace with that if we're getting some significant return. If we're getting return enough to where our players are getting paid out, our TOs are getting paid and shit, and their staff are getting paid. If we can do it in a way to where everybody is getting reward that is proportionate to how much they work, I think that's something that a lot of communities are okay with. The question that I want to ask you guys is, to what level are you okay with that? This is no different, right? You have to imagine, you saw the list of companies connected to this stuff, man. On some level, you can't imagine those guys give a shit about fighting games. But they are using the community, they are using players to be able to advertise, to market. But that's all the shit. That doesn't make them evil or anything like that. That's everywhere. That's I mean, that's all this stuff is. So my question to you is, how far along are you okay with that? That's really questions that you have to ask yourself. This isn't something where I'm coming at you and I'm giving you an answer, or I'm telling you this party's right, this party's wrong. It's not like that. It's something that you have to ask yourselves, because this is something that Daigo said, a week ago, about the people that put in the most work throughout the years to be able to try to support community and be able to grow it when it didn't have that support. Well, then you had devs even, come in and pretend to care because they all of a sudden perceived an opportunity to be able to market their product stronger. And for the most part, we were receptive to that because we were able to get something out of it. They were able to get something out of it, right? But how do you feel about people or groups that were not a part of planting and taking care of the seeds, but were able to take the fruits of that labor? What do you think? Let me know in the comments below.